This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to Roots and All. This week's guest is eco-gardener, landscape designer, permaculturist, horticultural thinker and garden experimenter, Sid Hill. Sid is concerned with building gardens that can sustain people and wildlife, and he's talking to me today about his particular brand of gardening, what we can do differently to improve our gardens, and the whole discipline of horticulture in the UK. He starts by telling me about his unique journey into horticulture.
So I've sort of always been a gardener because I was brought up by my parents who are both keen gardeners. And instead of going to school, I was brought up in a small holding and was taught about like permaculture, how to grow our food ecologically and preserve it. So we made jams, chutneys, juice, olive oil. And so I really, instead of sitting at a desk in school, I spent my days actually learning about gardening and tending the landscape. And I was really lucky that we had an edible forest garden. So I could go down to the edible forest garden each day and harvest berries for my breakfast or like tomatoes and vegetables for my lunch. And I think this upbringing really inspired me when I was a teenager, because I realised that all of this time I'd spent tending the landscape and at the time seeing it as sort of chores, actually I could make money from doing this. Yeah, when I was 15, I started a gardening business trying to focus on like permaculture design. But yeah, it was quite hard. It took a long time to build up the sort of client base. And so I decided to go to university and studied ethnobotany and landscape design, which my ideas were to focus on a sort of permaculture type education, but unfortunately they didn't teach that at university. So I sort of designed it doing ethnobotany, which is the study of useful plants and human culture, and landscape design, and I did this at the Eden Project. So in my ethnobotanical studies, my real focus was indigenous cultures and how they've tended the landscapes around them for their sustenance without degrading them, actually usually enhancing ecological health and diversity. So I was really interested in these different methods they used, like edible forest gardening, edible meadows, and I was interested in how we can tie this into our landscape designs as well, to learn from our past to create really diverse, abundant and healthy ecosystems for people and wildlife. So that was sort of, my route up to my landscape practice now.
And what sort of projects are you involved with now? What do you do kind of day to day?
So I run a landscape design and build business, and my sort of focus is really looking at how we can maximise the benefits of landscape for both people and wildlife. And really my passion is creating designed plant communities, drawing on the current research, but then applying ethnobotany. So how can we design edible forest gardens or meadows, which are really beautiful, and then provide a huge variety of different crops? And so that's led me into projects like I'm working on at the moment for the Trefusis estate, which is a large edible forest garden that the Trefusis family have owned this estate for 700 years. And the idea is to be designing an edible forest garden for future generations of the Trefusis family. And that's been a really exciting project. We're in sort of the second stage now. This idea of edible forest gardens is becoming quite popular today, and quite a lot of people know what it is, because we've learned from indigenous cultures that have tended woodlands around them for their food source. But we still have record of these edible forest gardens, and people are still tending them. But woodlands are a much more stable ecosystem, and longer term processes are involved in it. But actually, what isn't talked about is how we tended meadow ecosystems for our food source. So this is a big part of my research, and what I'm doing now is looking into how we can design herbaceous meadow plantings, but incorporating the thousands of edible plants available to us today, so that we can create these plantings that are really biodiverse, low maintenance, because the main maintenance is to cut them back once a year with some weeding and tending. They are really beautiful because you can apply aesthetic design theory, with our current garden design practice. And then you can also tie in so many different edible plants, because actually, there's like over 20,000 edible plants available to us today. And many of these are found in meadow plant communities. So I'm experimenting with it now in quite a few different gardens, this concept of designing seed mixes to create these really florally diverse and edible meadow plant communities. So that's really focusing on edible ecosystems, the edible meadows and edible forest gardens. And then I'm also really inspired at the moment about this idea of design through management and like creative gardening, because so much of the time our sort of landscape industry, we create designs which is like a product. Here you go, here's your design. And quite a lot of the time, this idea of like taking on a project, designing it, and then passing over this design, it actually doesn't really work on an ecological scale and also a longer time period. And so what I've been really interested in doing is an idea of creating your intentions for the land, and then creating or implementing your intentions and design for a longer period of management. And looking at this, because for me, it's allowing a longer term approach to landscape design, whereas a lot of the time, maybe someone might not have a budget of 10, 40,000 to do a project, but they might have a really wild, large bit of land, which is really interesting. It has all of this cultural and ecological history that can be sensitively worked with an intention for the land, and then that intention implemented over a longer period of time through creative management. And I think a lot of this thinking for me is really inspired by trying to progress from this idea of gardening as garden cleaning and not very skilled and just sort of cleaning and cleansing the landscape, and actually changing gardening into a creative ecological process, tapping into like conservation management and horticultural management, so we can take larger landscapes and be doing, say, mimicking grazing animals by cutting and disturbing the vegetation, or seeding over vegetation to have a light touch, or using large amounts of plug plants and controlled cutting to reduce some species. So I'm really exploring these ideas of creative management on some of my projects at the moment. I think that's one part what I'm really excited about.
There's a lot that kind of popped into my head as you were speaking then, and I think probably obviously the creative management, from that comes a design, or from that comes a site aesthetic. And in order to do that, I'm guessing you need to be invested in the site to the point where you're probably being fed by the site in order for you to have that influence. I mean, if you had a gardener and they were managing it for you, I'm not sure you would quite get that level of personal investment that you would get if it was actually the landowner who was making the design and editing decisions, and then were eating from that land. They're very much involved in it. And I can see all of that works fantastically, but maybe not so much for people who've got jobs which take them away from the garden 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. And I also see how that Indigenous people how they would have tended the land and shaped the land and everything. But again, I think possibly we would have had more time to do that. Does this work for us in our modern society with our lack of time and lack of connection to the land, just because we simply don't have time for the processes that we need in order to feed ourselves from it, and to even have that sort of time to engage in our creative side with the land? Can it work?
It's a good question and a challenge what we're facing now. And it's a multifaceted problem, really, because we've got this disconnection from the land, and then we've got overlapping issues from that, like globalized food system and industrial food, highly processed food, creating bad diets. And then also this disconnect from land having its effect on our mental health. So it's both an effect on our physical and mental health, this disconnection from the landscape. So if we can change the narrative, and I find a lot of the time what attracts a lot of my clients to my work is it's really putting importance on the connection to the land through food and necessity. And the whole time issue is often a struggle. But I think with the whole creative management, what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to put into a management document the processes involved to support either the client or gardener so they can implement these methods and tend the landscape. And I think that sort of is also going forwards from, at the moment, there's this very popular trend of creating ecological landscapes, or like ecological planting design and ecological design. And there's a lot of content and literature on that, how you actually design, let's say, an ecological planting on an ecological garden. But there's actually lacking, in my opinion, good information on how you actually manage these quite diverse ecological plantings over the longer periods of time. So what I'm really trying to do with my work at the moment is putting these different processes into a management document so that other people can carry on tending quite complex ecological landscapes.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and something that is invaluable for people, because that's where a lot of these things fall down. As you say, the gardens become a product, they're handed over, they don't have the knowledge. There's an element of having to be involved in your landscape and your space in order to be able to manage it, because things crop up and you don't really always know how to deal with them until you've dealt with them. But yeah, giving a management document is fantastic, because then that allows people to take on the responsibility and develop that relationship. I know, obviously, with the ecological landscapes, we have people recreating eco-regions, particularly on a larger scale. And quite often these don't involve necessarily native plants. And I know that when I saw you speaking at the Beth Chatto Symposium, there was a lot of talk around native versus non-native plants and their kind of relative merits. In terms of a food garden, I suppose a lot of varieties are cultivated. They are not native plants, because a lot of people say we have a real paucity of native flora when it comes to things that we can eat in the UK. Is that a problem for you as a wildlife gardener? And is that even true, or is that a bit of a misnomer?
I think there are a lot of native edible plants in the UK. But at the same time, this debate on whether to use natives or non-natives, and this sort of like for or against discussion is, in my opinion, it's a bit outdated now. Because actually, like at the Beth Chatto Symposium, for example, there were ecologists and people who are involved in rewilding, and everyone said, yes, ideally you would use only native plants. However, all of them admit to using non-native plants in their gardens anyway. Non-native plants are here throughout our landscape, and they're here to stay. And in my opinion, what do we actually call or classify as native? Because plants have developed quite complex seed dispersal methods that animals and the elements have been dispersing seeds across the planet throughout the history of plants. And now, because humans are now dispersing the seeds of very successful plants that have adapted specific attractive traits like fruit, flowers, they've developed these to disperse their genes. And now humans, as an animal and a part of the ecological system of the planet, we're now dispersing them because we like to grow them. And then we sort of come in and say, oh no, we shouldn't be doing that. However, if you look at also the sort of current science, and you look at places like Great Dixter, and actually it's now being proven that having a diverse vegetation of natives and non-natives can actually increase the ecological value of a landscape. So we may have some species like different native grasses and wildflowers or shrubs that provide the habitat and feed for specialist insects. And then we can supplement that with longer flowering period, different structural diversity for different insects by supplementing and adding in non-native plants. But then if we look at the food aspect of it, humans have been moving around the planet with their favourable plants throughout our history as we migrate. That's just been a natural process of our evolution, and we're still doing it. So I don't think there's anything wrong with using non-natives, and there's a lot of benefits that can be had from using them that outweigh the negatives. And there's quite often the discussion of, oh, but what about the invasive species? But actually, there's very few invasive species that have become a problem compared to the thousands of different plants we've introduced. And actually, a lot of the time, these invasive species are in very successful plants that could be taking up a niche and restoring the soil of the landscape, or growing in a place where there could be potential erosion on a riverbank. So I think this debate, for me, is sort of a bit outdated.
It's interesting talking about the soil and everything, and the kind of way it varies when you bring in different plants, because I was really interested about what you said about planting through brambles and how you're trying to kind of change almost the inner workings of the soil in order for it to support a different type of plant life. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah, and soil microbiology is really, well, actually microbiology in total is a passion of mine, and it's just so fascinating how the science is really coming forward with it. And if we look to the soil, there's so much science coming out which talks about the succession of soil microbiology as well as the succession of above land microbiology. So if you think above land succession goes through different stages of bare ground to annuals, perennials, longer lived perennials and shrubs, and then pioneer trees and longer lived trees. So above land, we have this succession of vegetation, and each stage of succession has a different soil microbiology that supports the plants, because when plants are growing, they're not growing as individuals, they're growing in a whole ecological web, which includes the soil microbiology. And the microbes in the soil are what are creating the favourable conditions and the available nutrients for healthy plant growth. So for like the example you just mentioned about planting into brambles, if we go into a field which is dominated by grass, like really vigorous lawn grass or something, let's say, when we try to plant oaks, which is a later stage succession tree, the soil microbiology might be higher in bacteria and the microbiology that supports herbaceous grasses, and not the microbiology that supports a oak tree. So looking at succession, what plants support the restoration and regeneration of forests? And that's brambles, because brambles, their ecological niche is they creep out from the hedgerow, shading out grass and herbaceous vegetation, and then they create the conditions necessary for trees to grow, both above the soil and below the soil. So above the soil, they are creating a more humid environment, holding in moisture. They are protecting from the wind or herbivores, so reducing the potential of deer or cattle or anything to come and graze them. And then if we look below ground as well, the brambles are going to be transitioning the soil microbiology from the biology that supports the grass into a biology that supports the trees, which if you go underneath a bramble patch and start scraping back some of the leaf litter, you'll find a lot of fungi activity, which is then going to be creating the mycorrhizal networks necessary to connect up the trees and share information and food. This thing of the science of the soil microbiology and the connections of mycorrhizal fungi are just fascinating. I've been doing research into my edible meadow plant communities in Italy, exploring different wild landscapes, and I found this one meadow with Vicia faba in it, broadbean. And all of these Vicia faba plants, what I found in this meadow, are looking really healthy. And they didn't have any signs of you get this aphid on a lot of Vicia faba plants when you grow them in your vegetable garden. And anyone who has grown them has probably experienced this. Quite often you would pinch out the tops to remove the green growth. And quite often when we grow them in the vegetable garden, we might be digging over each year, and that breaks up the mycorrhizal fungal networks in the soil. And what they've actually found now is Vicia faba is one of the plants that have connections through the mycelium in the soil, which then when a aphid starts eating on one plant, it sends information chemicals through the mycelium to other plants so they can start producing an alkaloid to defend them from the aphids. So it's this way of actually communicating through the soil to other plants so they can defend themselves. But if we grow in a vegetable garden where we dig over each year, we break up these really valuable networks of mycelium. And then the plants are like babies. They need us to defend them. They don't have the same adaptability. Yeah, so it's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, it is actually. It really is. In that vein, is there anything that you could recommend people looking into? And I asked this question because my final question was going to be, what is the kind of future of gardening as you see it, and what would you like it to be? But I think that does very much tie into what are particular areas that you think we're going to start working more in tandem with as gardeners.
So the future of gardening, and I think it's been an interesting one for me as I came into this work quite early as a teenager. And I really feel like for too long, gardening has been seen as like an unskilled labour. And I remember so many times when people asked me what I was studying or what I did, and I said horticulture. I remember this one time, a girl like around my age when I was a teenager, and she went, "What? You're studying horticulture?" I didn't know you could study horticulture, and she didn't even know what horticulture was. And then I think a lot of people just think as gardeners or horticulturists, we just arrange pretty flowers. And this is the narrative that has been communicated for so long, is this sort of like gardeners and horticulturalists as a luxury and just an ornate practice. Whereas I think going into the future, as a horticulturalists and gardeners, we can change the narrative and focus on actually climate change adaptation, food security, increasing biodiversity, and reduction or the mitigation of flooding. And if we change the narrative and we focus on telling this story, it suddenly becomes a really attractive and meaningful field to get into for like my generation. And I've noticed in the time I've been doing this work, how if you talk about horticulture like that, so many teenagers and young people then go, "Oh, wow, I didn't even know that I could do all of this important work being a gardener." It was interesting for me as well when I came into this, because actually when I was 15, after being taught about permaculture and climate change and peak oil and all of these quite huge topics, I became quite depressed about feeling the overwhelm and not being able to act on these issues and feeling very small and insignificant. And actually, when I came across this video, even though I'd already been taught about permaculture, I didn't make the links. And then I came across this video of Jeff Lawton, who's a permaculture designer, and he was regreening the Jordan Desert, creating edible forest gardens, which were capturing moisture to and then regreen the desert, providing people with jobs and improving their lives. And when I realised, oh, bloody hell, actually, as a gardener, I can do these incredible things and have real meaning in my work. So I think in the future of horticulture, we need to change the narrative and show the importance and how it's a necessity, not a luxury.
Thank you very much to Sid for taking part in this interview and to you for listening. If you like this episode, check out my episodes with John Little and with Toby Diggins. Links are in the show notes. Dr. Ian Bedford is with us now, discussing the merits of everyone's favourite garden resident.
It's quite often the case, when creatures are found in the garden that look like a typical plant pest, that they're inevitably assumed to be a pest, and consequently, those creatures receive an untimely death. However, the sad fact is that some of these will not only be innocent of any wrongdoings, but will actually have been of immense benefit to the garden. And probably the most unfairly judged and persecuted class of creatures are the gastropods, in particular the terrestrial slugs, which evolved from snails around 150 million years ago. And over the many following millennia, slugs have played a leading role within nature's cleaning department, with some feeding on and recycling dead and decaying organic matter, whilst others feeding on plants, and in doing so, suppressing the spread of the more fecund and fast-growing plant species. Here in Britain, we currently have around 40 slug species, with just a small number of those being the herbivorous slugs that can cause problems to our cultivated plants and crops. But it's their nocturnal and often covert feeding activity that's led to a general assumption that all slugs are plant pests. And so products and techniques for eradicating slugs are often used without realising that, in addition to killing the herbivorous species, those that feed on dead and decaying organic matter are also affected, as are the leopard slugs that predate on other slugs. So what could we do if we prefer to control the herbivorous slugs without harming the species that can benefit the garden? Well, avoiding the use of slug pellets would be an obvious answer, since they contain a bait that will entice most slugs to eat them and ingest a toxin. And beer traps too, which can also attract and kill beneficial slugs. Non-lethal alternatives, though, would involve using deterrents and repellents as barriers around susceptible plants, protecting them from damage whilst leaving the slugs alive for the many garden creatures that depend on them as food. However, this might not always be possible in certain situations, particularly when the slugs are feeding within the soil. So in this case, a more hands-on approach would be needed, one that involves being able to identify and manually remove just the problematic slug species as and when they're found. A task that isn't as formidable as it might first seem, since besides keeled slugs, which live underground and are shaped like the hull of an upturned boat, the most likely slugs to damage plants will belong to just two species, both of which are not only widespread and numerous, but quite distinctive because they're small slugs, growing no bigger than 2 centimetres in length. And they're the black gardener slug, with its black body and orange underside, and the grey field slug, which is white or pale buff in colour. And both of these little slugs can easily be removed from the areas of the garden where they're a problem, simply by laying damp cardboard on the ground overnight and collecting them from underneath in the morning, sometimes in their hundreds.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, Please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.